Hello. So I wanted to ask you guys, I'm bringing Elizabeth and Libby here on live really quick today because we just learned this past week that Florida Fish Wildlife Conservation Agency is planning to stop the feeding program for the manatees. And I just wanted to have a quick conversation about that. I guess I wanted to start off with, were they ever serious to begin with on this feeding program? How do you guys feel about this?
No.
No.
No,
There's
I
a reason
no,
there was a
you know,
pause.
it never felt genuine. It never felt genuine at all. Um, strictly because it came about because of the public outcry of what was happening. So the feeding program was a band-aid. It felt like, definitely seemed like it was just trying to kind of appease the public. Um, so yeah, that's my 2 cents on that. It never felt right. It just never felt right.
Well, I felt like that there was such a public nightmare after we had uncovered the fact that there was an unusual mortality
Yeah.
event a few years back, that the agency felt this immense amount of pressure to do something because there was national attention on this. And it was a really, really bad look on the agency because of the national attention that it had received. And in my opinion, I don't think they ever intended, I don't think they ever even wanted to do the feeding program. I don't think they ever really intended on making any long term decisions regarding the feeding program. I think it was a last minute thing that they did to appease the public and appease
Right.
advocates. And
Yep.
it's really frustrating because, now they're saying, well, the reason why we're stopping the feeding program is because there's seagrass in the Mosquito Lagoon. And so it should be fine. But, there's not enough seagrass to sustain them. They're already sick and they're already, dealing with the impacts of the immense amount of pollution that's gone into the Indian River Lagoon. So I question, I question why they even have the word conservation in their title. I know that a lot of their focus in a state agency like this is fishing and hunting. Let's be honest.
Mm-hmm.
Manatees are probably the last of their priority, and we were hearing rumors throughout the agency from the very beginning. And I'll show you a photo of the very, very beginning. This is like one of the first few manatees. There's a few in that trailer that they had found in the northern Indian River Lagoon after that 7 million gallon sewage spill in
Yep.
Titusville. And so I just, for me, I call it the dog and pony show. I think many of us that were there, boots on the ground, following this story, documenting it, videoing it, it was a dog and pony show to us because they were putting out this message: we're rescuing the manatees, and they were recovering way more manatees than they were rescuing, from what we had learned following the agencies and seeing what they were doing there in on at the boat ramps throughout the county.
So, and that's a really important point to make because, not that again, here we are in another situation where we're not talking about the workers, and we're not talking about the men and women that are out there actually doing the rescues and performing the work that needs to be done. There's a problem at the policy level. There's a problem where money is being spent and handled on what direction and where and how. And there's a problem with the fact that we're not addressing the sources of pollution that are causing the problem in the first place. But when it comes to when you know we're seeing these big trucks that are painted, we're rescuing these manatees, manatee rescue, you see these teams and all of this publicity, right? And you realize that statewide, in that first round of the unusual mortality event that was happening, there were something like 1,100 manatees that had died statewide, and over like 900 of them were right here in Brevard County. So when they're talking about rescuing, we're talking numbers like less than a dozen. I don't remember exactly what it was, but there simply are not enough facilities. There are not enough people. There's not enough resources to save an entire species. And I'll tell you, you know, we had this conversation where it hit me a couple weeks ago. I stood there and watched the demise of a whole species in my own community.
And speaking of that, can I show a video real quick to kind of bring people into what we witness day in
Yeah,
and
and then
day
I
out?
want to talk about FWC a little bit.
Yeah, let me show them. This is this. Okay, so that's just a video of them, stacking up their
So,
trailers.
you said dog and pony show, and that's exactly what the script was. There was a government script for a dog and pony show, you guys, and what we saw was them playing by the script. So the Florida Game and Freshwater Fish Commission was originally established to control hunting and fishing. Okay? They slapped the name conservation in there because they didn't want to expand protections and conservation efforts in Florida. So they expanded FWC. This is my opinion and my perception, so take it for what it's worth. They expanded FWC's duties and responsibilities to make it look like they were conserving species and protecting species. And yes, they were to an extent because they need to protect the species to have sustainable hunting and fishing. But remember, the goal being hunting and fishing, okay? Not protection of our ecosystems as a priority. The priority is to manage hunting and fishing. Are we clear on that? So when they expanded that agency, they also created a PR campaign to try to get Florida out of the blemish that it is on the US for land conservation and environmental degradation. We're like up there at the top of the list of states that degrade its environment for profit. And FWC was put under a lot of pressure when Stell Bailey went out there and spent a day filling up muck jars and had them delivered to our legislators. Our legislators then called FWC and demanded answers. That's why a dog and pony show ensued. They decided they needed to make it look like they gave a damn about the manatees, and they don't. They wouldn't have fed them lettuce if they had. It's non-nutritional. There's plenty of aquatic vegetation that is loaded with nutrients that they could have fed them, especially invasive species. These were recommended, but it was never their intention to feed or save the species. That is definitely obvious when you look at the lottery system that they used to save the distressed manatees that were called in. We watched so many die, and they go out and pick up one and bring it back. And there'd be a big show about how they saved one. Watching hundreds perish, and we're begging for more resources, more manpower. But remember, the goal was never to save the manatees. It was to make it look like they were. So the legislators could go back and tell their constituents, we're taking care of it. They're going to feed the manatees. They're going to do all these great things. Meanwhile, we're sitting back choking because we know this is not fixing anything. And then we saw a downplay response last year. We almost saw a cover up, right? Unfortunately, we can't say it was because we can't prove it. But what we saw was them change the location that they
I have pictures of that. I'm bringing them up right now.
So there they are. They're behind fencing and away from the road. You can't see them bringing the manatees in. So the year before, we were able to report on what we were seeing, and the numbers had to match what they were reporting, or else it would be obvious that they were underreporting, which they are notorious for. Now there's no way to verify what they're reporting.
Yeah, because they're hidden. So what we saw last year uncover, and a lot of people didn't realize that we had still went out into the field and documented both video and photo documentation. We just didn't post it as much on social media this past year, January, February, during that cold snap, because we were, collecting footage for a documentary that we had been shooting all at the beginning of the year, that's focused around primarily this whole manatee incident and throughout the state of Florida. And so they would be behind these gates that no one could get behind. It was very, very difficult and concealed. You couldn't take hardly any photos. You had to be set up across the street. You had to be set up on the water. You had to have access to a boat. And that's exactly what we did. We would take boats out. We would rent boats. We would get out there on kayaks. It was a lot of work. It was, if you didn't grow up in this area, you wouldn't have known where to go, how to get to that point. I mean, I grew up here with my dad fishing on these waterways and taking the boats out exactly in this area. So we gathered all that. There's a lot of never seen before footage that people are going to see in this documentary. And some of it, even this, they painted a mural. And that kind of takes me into my next question that I have regarding this whole feeding program, because another thing that we saw unfold, you talk about the muck jars, right, Libby? Well, one of the things I saw unfold is that we had brought so much mass awareness as advocates here, boots on the ground, that people were able to raise millions of dollars off of this situation. And it wasn't just the agencies getting appropriations from our state leaders and from, the state, but it was also organizations that exploited the manatees and said, we're raising money to feed the manatees. We need money to feed the manatees. Donate here, donate here. We need to be able to buy lettuce, but you can't donate lettuce. You had companies and farmers ready to stand up and donate what it took to feed these manatees, and they refused to take those donations for one reason or another. And instead, they wanted money, 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 money.
They started the fundraiser.
Yes, they started the fundraisers. And if you go back to the agency, a lot of money was spent on painting these murals on near the manatee, where they warm the manatees up, which is this power plant in Port St. John, Florida, right here. This is from the waterways. You see where they weren't painted. Now they're painted. So there they are right before they painted them. And now that's it painted. They also got these trucks.
It's like putting a monument of a murderer on top of a tombstone of his victim.
Yep.
In my opinion.
Yeah. It's frustrating watching this all unfold, and they're selling this narrative to the general public in our community that, they did everything in their power to save these manatees and that they were feeding them. And from the very beginning, we kept asking, what's your long-term goal here? Because we're interrupting their migration patterns. We have totally decimated their habitat. So, and then we just had the city of Titusville, the city council meeting a few months back, where they were kind of laughing at the fact that the manatees were trying to get through the cages where they were growing seagrass because they're still starving. They're still starving today.
They're still starving.
That's right. There's just a lot less of them starving because most of them died.
They're willing to knock down metal cages to get.
And now they're saying that they can feed themselves this year. They'll be all right because there's some seagrass left.
And then that plays into the narrative. You've got a group of people in our community that are saying that it's the manatees' fault that we do not have seagrass. So, I guess they're okay with people blaming the manatees if they go over to Mosquito Lagoon and completely decimate all of that seagrass that we finally just got to grow and come back.
Well, sure they are, because FWC would be glad to control a manatee hunt, just like they'd be glad to control an air hunt.
I want to touch on something that you brought up a moment ago about how people were willing to volunteer. People, the farmers were willing to provide whatever was needed. And I think that was during that whole situation. I think that was our biggest frustration as we stood there at these boat ramps And we saw the biggest resource that we have is our people. And we saw these people coming in, the boaters, the fishermen. These guys were like, well, we have trucks, we have boats, we have the ability. Like, I would be happy to go out and harvest hydrilla to make sure that these manatees could eat, or, you know, the whole like the whole entire lagoon, the entire span of the lagoon, full of these people that love this place and don't want to see the ecosystems fall apart, are willing to help. We have a resource there that doesn't cost the government money, and it doesn't come with a fundraiser, and it doesn't come with a license plate. It's people. And, you know, maybe the government needs to just start trusting the people a little bit. Like, maybe that might help, because,
Maybe they should stop
you know,
threatening
we
to
vote,
arrest
we tell
people
you
who
what
are
we
trying to
want, we
feed
don't
them.
get right. You know, it was ridiculous. They were starving. If someone is starving in front of you and you don't feed them, you're a monster.
Here's a shot of us at the boat ramp. For those just tuning in, I'm going to show you kind of what we've gone through documenting this. I have hundreds of hours of footage, but here's just some. That's how many. I mean, that boat ramp was full of nothing but the agency and their boats and their trailers and their trucks. They even had to get rent enterprise trucks, because that's how many manatees they were finding in the waterways. And as many people know, the cold
We
snap.
know they were bringing people in from other states to come here and work because they needed help with the recovery. There were so many. I mean, that was mostly there at the Port St. John boat ramp, but, you know, and I was there a lot. They were pulling in 5 or 6 manatees a day just at that one boat ramp.
Here's another one. I'm only going to show it briefly.
Remember, these were recovery missions, not rescue missions. No. And I want to take you back a little bit further to the beginning. If anyone questions whether their directive from the beginning was to cover this up and remained that to this day, I want to remind you, they dumped all of their carcasses on an island far away from anyone to be able to see until somebody found it. And then there's a manatee graveyard out there on an island somewhere on a shoreline. That's our shame.
Speaking of the carcasses, I'm going to share, keep talking. I'm going to share that page you shared with me of their page where they're doing the examinations. Can you see it?
Yeah, so FWC has a UME page for the manatees, and they've got a lot of information that is accurate. But this picture in there, I want you guys to look at, because it's extremely important. The manatees, the sea cows, they're usually very big and round. They got big round heads. What happens is their bodies liquefy and basically collapse, and their heads do the same, and they become deformed, and they look like they're called a peanut head. They start to look peanut shaped. They will spend a lot of time at the surface of the water because for many reasons, one of which is they can't maintain their warmth. They're having trouble breathing. Also, you will find them beached because they're going on shore to look for food. So when you see manatees deformed, call FWC. When you see manatees in distress, call FWC. When you see manatees lingering on the top of the water, they don't do that. That's unusual behavior. Call FWC and report it. One of the reasons that we got the responses that we got is because we were able to motivate people to call FWC and report every single sighting they could, such that people were actually going out and looking for distressed manatees because they wanted to save them. And so FWC was having an unusual amount of calls, even for an event like this, because usually there's not a response like that from the community. Well, we had that response and we need that response. So please, if you see them in distress, call FWC and report it and follow up. You can ask them to call you and give you a report on what happened to the manatee. And they are very responsive. I love the biologists in the field. I think they do a great job. The problem that I have with FWC is not their biologists. It's not their technicians. It's the agency itself. It's been a blemish on Florida for decades, and with good reason. They have been poisoning our waterways with glyphosate, with aquatic weed killer, if you will, to the extent that it has killed all vegetation, turning it into muck. It sinks to the bottom of the seafloor, and it contains phosphorus and nitrogen, but mostly phosphorus, high levels of phosphorus. This phosphorus feeds algal blooms, chokes out the sunlight. Seagrass cannot grow in a seafloor that is covered in muck and that sunlight cannot reach. That's what happened to their food supply. FWC destroyed their food supply. And then municipalities like the city of Titusville added insult to injury and dumps millions of gallons. Not one instance, multiple instances through the decades. They used to just dump the sewage, then they treated it and dumped the treated water. And then anytime there's a backup or an overflow, they flush that into the river. And they're not the only culprit. Many coastal communities do, and it's a shame, but it happens. Titusville is just one of the worst offenders, and they just happen to be centrally located where the manatees migrate to the springs from the Indian River Lagoon. And we basically attacked their migration route so that they can't survive to make it to the springs. So they head over to the power plant where there's at least warmth. Maybe they can stay warm long enough. Most of them didn't.
And so that's what's going to happen again here in the upcoming months is we have winter approaching, and I suspect that we have a much less population in the Indian River Lagoon because of this unusual mortality event. And I do suspect that there will be more cold stress on these manatees. You have to remember, I mean, just because a little bit of seagrass came back, they've been sick for how
we had a really mild winter last year. We had a mild winter last year.
That too.
That definitely helped. I mean, we were all bracing ourselves, and then kind of winter just kind of never happened. So, what happens this year? What happens this year? Because Mother Nature is forgiving sometimes, but not all the time. She's not gonna let us get away with that for years and years in a row.
At that very location that we were talking about, the 7 million gallons recently that went through a couple years ago, at that very location, a lot of people may not know that we've been monitoring that location, and it's still testing high for fecal coliform and E. coli because the city's infrastructure has totally collapsed. It's leaking like nobody's business, okay? They can't find a leak, so they had to hire a company to come in and do I think it's called a biometric tracking or some sort of biological tracking, because they've exhausted all of their resources at the city of Titusville. And I got to commend Cook. At least he acknowledged that he was outside of his scope and he got the right company to do it. And we're looking for hopefully identifying that source. And they are doing forced main replacement. They have upgraded their Osprey plant. They're doing the things finally. Unfortunately, we're several decades past the point they should have done it. So it's just seething sewage into the lagoon at that location. So once again, the water quality there is abysmal.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, and I mean, not to I hate to sound so gloomy, but in a community, in a place where, powers that be are not even willing to warn their own residents not to swim in water with high levels of sewage, what's going to make them care about the death of those manatees?
Let's talk about that. Yeah. So the Department of Health says it's not my job to warn, it's the Department of Environmental Protection. The Department of Environmental Protection says they're lying. It's their job to warn. Then the Department of Health says, no, we're not going to warn. It's not up to us to create that messaging. We're going to let Titusville and the Department of Environmental Protection create that messaging. So guess who refused to create the messaging? The city of Titusville, the Department of Health, and the Department of Environmental Protection. Who's
Right.
protecting?
And then the citizens, they realize that there's a problem. They try to warn people and let them know, like, hey, maybe you shouldn't be eating that fish out of that river. Maybe you shouldn't be letting your 2-year-old swim in there because that's pretty bad. And hey, did you know that there was a kid paralyzed in this water? Like, somehow, like, the citizens that have gone out and like tried to tell people, like, they're the wrong ones. Like, now y'all are swimming in sewage. You're letting people do this. You're letting people do this. It's so dangerous. I don't know. It's if you're a homeowner and you have a cracked front step and you invite people to your home and somebody falls and breaks their leg, you're liable for that. And I feel like that waterway is the same way. Like, people are coming here from all over the place, swimming, fishing, playing, recreating, getting in that water with their children and their pets. And, like, you didn't tell me your front step was cracked and now my leg's broken.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. FWC's response was, when questioned about stopping the program and what to do with manatees that are still suffering, we have a plan if we receive reports of distressed manatees. What's that plan? Why can't you tell us what that plan is? Because you don't have one.
Well, and we see how well their planning has gone thus far, right?
Thank you.
I mean, they haven't had any long-term plans. We're not addressing the migration. We're not addressing the sources of pollution. Their plan with the feeding was, like I said, done under pressure. I don't think they ever really wanted to do that to begin with, but they felt an immense amount of pressure to do it. You're right. Where is the plan? And because when we were calling in deceased manatees, I remember Elizabeth seeing 2 distressed manatees, one with a baby, and she called it in, waited at the boat ramp for 3.5 hours. They didn't show up until the following day, and the baby was already
I remember
gone.
that. That was during the height of it. I remember that. That's when they were having to bring people in from other states, because we actually criticized them because they didn't have enough manpower to rescue. And we were criticizing, this is not a rescue mission. This is a recovery mission only. They are not prioritizing rescue.
And by the way, they pay their sprayers, the people that spray the poisons all along our waterways, they pay them more than they pay their biologists. They're paying them $25 an hour, the sprayers, the people spraying the poisons, but they're paying their biologists, like maybe $15 an hour. They're paying the sprayers more money.
And there's a reason for that. You have to ask why. They don't want quality biologists. They just don't. They don't want anybody to do that job and to be honest and report.
Or is it because they don't value the biologists as much as they do the sprayers? Or are the chemical companies compensating there? Yeah, you have to ask yourself why.
You gotta pay people good money. You have to pay people good money to expose themselves to chemicals all the time.
So let's talk about the money. Okay, I don't have the numbers in front of me. Google what the spray budget is for FWC. It's astronomical.
Oh man, I have an article about this.
Let me tell you what they do every year. They have to use their supply to increase their supply budget. So every year they say they maxed out their supply, and every year they order more supply. So every year they're dumping more chemicals than the year before, and they're increasing their budget to do it.
Listen to this. FWC stops posting work plans for herbicide spraying online. You know what else they did? They stopped posting where they're spraying, because they said that they're afraid for their safety, because people, what the reality was is there was advocates that were documenting them spraying all this poison in the waterways, and they don't want to be documented doing that. And it's not about the workers. Let's be clear here, because they always want to make it about the workers. Well, it's our worker safety and they're bothering the workers. No, we don't. We appreciate the workers. We know that they're just there to do a job, and they're there to get a paycheck, and they're there to put food on the table. I understand that. We understand that. What we are trying to bring awareness to are the policies, what's going on in Tallahassee. That's why it needs to be documented, because it comes from somewhere. That comes from Tallahassee down. They are and even our county, they're approving the budget.
But it wasn't until the muck jars went to Tallahassee that we got any action. So what we need to remember is put the pressure on your legislators. That's who's going to put the pressure on the agencies and get anything done. We're not going to get shit done pissing and moaning, arguing amongst ourselves about what the right way to attack this problem is. The right way to attack this problem is to go to Tallahassee, write your legislators, get FaceTime. That's the only way to do it.
And with that being said, I know we're running out of time. Elizabeth, you want to say something really quick?
Yeah, because this comes up every year when we start getting into the cold season. We start hearing the misinformation about these wonderful creatures. Number one, manatees are indigenous to the state of Florida. They belong there. They predate humans. They were there before us. End of story. They are an indigenous creature that belongs there. Number two, they did not eat themselves out of seagrass. That did not happen. What happened is we, humans, did things like overfish and allow all sorts of kinds of pollution to get into that water. And eventually it killed the seagrass. So, like, that misinformation drives me crazy every year. The manatees belong here. They deserve to live here. They deserve to be in clean and healthy and safe waters just as much as we should all have a right to clean water. So
okay, so keep tuned in, because we were just talking about going to Tallahassee, and we are working on doing a retreat next month, and we are going to talk more with advocates from across the state of Florida about how they can be effective in their advocacy work. And this is part of it right here, right? So you were just talking about, Libby, going to Tallahassee, talking to your legislators face to face. We're going to have workshops. We're going to teach our community. We're going to teach advocates how to be successful in this. And we got to hop off here, guys, because everybody has to get back to work. But I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and we will talk soon.